They put me at the table nearest the exit doors. Not because the venue was full, not because the seating chart had run out of room. There were empty chairs at the family table, the long rectangular one draped in white linen and set with the good china my mother had spent 3 weeks selecting. I counted them from where I sat. 3 empty chairs, close enough that I could see my father's face when he laughed. Close enough that I could read the gold lettering on the anniversary cake, but my name card was here, in the far corner of the ballroom, tucked between a ficus tree and a ceramic pot and the door that led to the catering kitchen. Every time a server pushed through that door, the smell of roasted chicken and warm rolls drifted over me like a reminder that I was adjacent to the help, not the honored guests. I told myself it didn't matter. I had told myself that my entire life. What I didn't know, when I smoothed my dress and straightened my back and tried to look like a woman who had chosen this corner on purpose, was that the evening was about to change. Because walking through the main entrance at that exact moment, scanning the room with the focused, unhurried calm of someone who had managed real emergencies, was Director Warren Cole, the man who had stood beside me in the ash and smoke of the Ridgeline fire 14 months ago. The man who had watched me pull 3 people out of a collapsing structure while half my crew was being redirected elsewhere. He hadn't seen me yet, but he would. And when he did, everything my family had quietly decided about my place in this room was going to become very difficult to maintain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My parents' 40th anniversary party was held at the Whitmore Estate, a venue about 20 minutes outside of Columbus that specialized in exactly the kind of event my mother had been quietly planning for a decade. String lights over the courtyard, a 12-piece band, round tables with centerpieces so tall you had to lean sideways to speak to the person across from you. My mother had sent save-the-date cards 8 months in advance. She had a color scheme. She had a hashtag. I drove in from Pittsburgh the morning of the party, 6 hours in my truck, stopping once for gas and a cup of coffee that tasted like motor oil, arriving at my childhood home in Glenview just after noon. My parents' house smelled the same as it always had. My mother's candles, the particular chemical sweetness of the carpet cleaner she'd used since I was small, the faint undertone of my father's coffee. I stood in the hallway with my overnight bag and took a breath and tried to feel like I was home. My brother's car was already in the driveway. His wife's minivan was parked behind it. Their 2 kids, 5 and 7, were somewhere in the backyard, and I could hear them shrieking the way only children who feel entirely safe and welcome can shriek. My brother Kyle had been living 12 minutes from my parents for his entire adult life. He had taken over my father's landscaping business at 24. He coached Little League. He showed up every Sunday for dinner. He was, in my father's words, the kind of son that made a man feel like he'd done something right. I was the kind of daughter that made a man feel confused. I had wanted to be a firefighter since I was 9 years old, which meant that from roughly the age of 9 onward, my father had been trying to redirect that impulse into something more suitable. He wasn't cruel about it. He was patient, methodical, the way he was about everything. He took me to career fairs. He talked about nursing, about teaching, about accounting. He said things like, "You can do anything you put your mind to," and then watched with visible unease every time I put my mind to running drills in the backyard with a garden hose and a stopwatch. I joined the Columbus Fire Department at 22. My mother teared up in a way that was hard to read. My father shook my hand, which was formal enough that it answered the question I hadn't asked out loud. Kyle texted me, "Kind of a weird choice, but good luck," and that was the most enthusiasm my career ever generated from my immediate family. By 31, I was the youngest female battalion chief in Franklin County history. I had led crews through 4 major structure fires, 2 wildfire mutual aid deployments, and a flooding event that resulted in my team extracting 11 people from a partially submerged neighborhood on the east side. I had been written up in the Columbus Dispatch, been invited to speak at a state emergency management conference, and received a commendation from the governor's office. My mother framed the newspaper article. She put it in the hallway near the guest bathroom, behind the door, where you had to push the door halfway shut to see it. Kyle's Regional Landscaping Award was above the fireplace. I thought about that on the drive to Whitmore Estate. I thought about it while I was changing into my dress in the venue's restroom. the one with the flickering bulb over the third mirror. I had bought the dress 3 weeks ago, navy blue, simple, the kind of thing that worked for events when you weren't entirely sure what you were being invited to participate in. When I came out and found my name card, I stood there for a long moment. The table was set for 8. There was no one I recognized assigned to any of the other seats. A cousin from my mother's side who I had met twice. A neighbor couple whose names I vaguely remembered. My father's former accountant, apparently, and his wife. I was not at the family table. I was not at the head table. I was not even near the middle of the room, where the other extended family clusters were filling in around the centerpieces with their tall arrangements of white flowers. I was by the kitchen door, next to the ficus, with a partial view of the dance floor if I craned my neck. I sat down, folded my hands, and reminded myself that I was 31 years old and I did not need a specific chair to tell me who I was. Growing up, I had learned early that the Carter family narrative had a main character, and it was not me. My father was the protagonist, in the way that certain fathers become the gravitational center of a family's entire self-image. Kyle was the heir apparent, the one who would extend the story forward. I was a supporting character, present, tolerated, occasionally pointed to as evidence of the family's open-mindedness. Our daughter does something with firefighting, very brave, but never central. Never the point. It had started small, the way these things always do. The year I made varsity soccer, Kyle was being recruited by 2 different landscaping companies to do his apprenticeship. The year I graduated top of my fire academy class, Kyle got engaged to his college girlfriend, and the dinner table that week was dominated by ring size and venue discussions. The year I got my promotion, my father called to congratulate me, and then spent 11 of the 13 minutes of that phone call talking about how Kyle had just signed a contract with a new commercial client. I stopped expecting the spotlight. I stopped looking for it. I got very good at being competent in rooms where no one was paying attention to me, which, it turned out, was excellent training for emergency response. But competence without acknowledgement accumulates weight over time. By the time I drove to my parents' 40th anniversary dinner, the weight had become something I simply carried, the way you carry an old injury. You stop noticing it until someone bumps against it. The bump came during the cocktail hour, before dinner was even served. My father moved through the room like a man in his element, which he was. He shook hands with the ease of someone who had spent 4 decades building a network of people who liked him. He was good at this, genuinely good, and watching him work a room was one of the few things I had always admired about him without reservation. He guided guests toward the bar, touched shoulders, laughed loudly at the right moments. Kyle orbited near him naturally the way Kyle always did. At one point, a couple from my parents' church stopped them both near the display table where family photos were arranged in chronological order. The wife was looking at the photos, making warm, appreciative sounds. The husband turned to my father and said, "Your whole family looks wonderful, Tom. You must be proud." My father smiled broadly, very proud. "Kyle here runs the business now, doing better than I ever did." He clapped Kyle on the shoulder. "And the grandkids? Lord, don't get me started on the grandkids." The husband glanced around. "Do you have other children?" My father nodded. "A daughter. She's here somewhere." He gestured vaguely toward the back half of the room, the direction of the kitchen door and the ficus and my table for 8. She's in fire and rescue. Up in Pittsburgh. "Oh, how interesting," the woman said, with the particular tone people use when they mean the opposite. My father agreed, and the conversation moved on to Kyle's commercial contract and the grandchildren's soccer games. I was standing 8 feet away, close enough to hear every word. I had been walking toward them when the conversation started, and I had simply stopped, one hand wrapped loosely around my glass of sparkling water, and listened to my father describe my existence in the same way you might describe a distant relative's hobby. I turned around and walked back to my table. I told myself I would eat the dinner. I would applaud through the toasts. I would hug my parents and tell them congratulations, and I would drive back to Pittsburgh in the morning with the quiet, familiar feeling of having been somewhere I was never quite asked to be. I had done it before. I could do it again. What I didn't count on was Director Warren Cole. He arrived about 20 minutes before dinner, and I only noticed him because the energy near the entrance changed the way it always does when someone well-known walks into a room. A few heads turned. A few conversations paused. He was 62, broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples and the kind of unhurried authority that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with having managed genuinely serious situations for 30 years. He was Ohio's Director of Emergency Management, a position he'd held through 3 administrations because no governor, regardless of party, wanted to lose the man who had overhauled the state's disaster response infrastructure from the ground up. He was also one of the few people outside my department who understood what had happened at the Ridgeline fire. I hadn't known he would be here. I later learned his wife had been on my mother's charity board years ago, that they'd kept a loose friendship across the decades, and that the anniversary invitation had been extended and accepted quietly without any particular fanfare. My parents likely didn't know exactly who he was. To them, he was probably Patricia Cole's husband, a government man of some kind, coming to be polite. He scanned the room the way people in emergency management always scan rooms, methodically, left to right, cataloging exits and gathering information. And then his gaze landed on me, and he did a slight double take, the kind that means I know you, but I'm not sure why you're here. I lifted a hand in a small wave. He crossed the room with the directness of a man who did not walk anywhere slowly, and by the time he reached my table, I was already standing. "Chief Carter," he said, and the words landed with a small shock, because no one in this building had called me that. No one in this building had called me anything, really. "Director Cole," I said, "I didn't know you'd be here." He glanced at the table, at the ficus beside it, at the kitchen door 3 feet away, at the 6 empty seats waiting for a retired accountant and a twice-met cousin. His expression was measured, but I had worked enough incident scenes with this man to read the tightening around his eyes. "Your parents' party," he said. "Yes, sir." He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down without ceremony, as if he had decided something. "Tell me how you ended up at the catering table." I opened my mouth to say it was fine, that there had been a seating mix-up, that it didn't matter. I had the deflection ready. I had been practicing it since I found the name card. Instead, I heard myself say, quietly, "It wasn't a mix-up." He looked at me for a long moment. "No," he said, "I didn't think so." He stayed. He could have made an excuse, found his own assigned seat, rejoined the flow of the party. He didn't. He sat beside me through the cocktail hour while guests drifted past, some recognizing him, most not, all registering that whoever was seated with the director was someone worth acknowledging. A city councilman came to shake his hand. A local contractor with my father's firm introduced himself. Each time, Director Cole responded warmly and made a point of turning to me. "This is Battalion Chief Megan Carter," he said, every time. "Not this is the daughter, not Tom's girl. This is Battalion Chief Carter, who led the Ridgeline mutual aid response last year." The contractor blinked. "The Ridgeline fire? I heard about that. 3 people pulled from the Harmon building?" 4, Director Cole corrected. Chief Carter's crew extracted 4 survivors from a structure that the original incident commander had already called for evacuation. The contractor looked at me differently after that. Most people did. When dinner was announced and guests began finding their seats, the director stood and said simply, "Come with me." "Sir, my seat is here." He looked at me with the same expression he'd used once on a county official who had tried to redirect resources mid-crisis for political reasons. The expression that said he had already calculated every counter-argument and found them insufficient. "Your seat," he said, "is wherever I say it is tonight." And because I had followed his direction in smoke-filled buildings where the ceiling was uncertain and the floor plan had changed, I followed him now. He walked to the family table. My father was already seated, my mother beside him, Kyle on his left with his wife. The 3 empty chairs were still there. The director pulled one out without asking, set my name card down, and looked at my father with a pleasantness that had steel underneath it. "Tom, I hope you don't mind. I've been wanting to spend time with your daughter all evening." My father blinked. Of course, Warren. Of course. I sat. The feeling was disorienting, the way it always is when a thing you'd prepared yourself to accept is suddenly, simply, not happening. I was at the family table. I could see my mother's face. I could reach the breadbasket without leaning. I was, for the first time in the evening, in the center of a room I had every right to be in. My father looked at me with something that was trying to be a smile and not quite getting there. My mother refilled my water glass and patted my hand and moved on before I could read what was behind her eyes. Dinner was served. The conversation at the table wound through the comfortable channels it always followed. Kyle's business, the grandchildren's schools, a neighbor's recent renovation. Director Cole participated graciously, asking questions, laughing when appropriate. But he also kept turning the conversation back. Megan, tell them about the flooding response in March. Or, your daughter's department was the first mutual aid arrival at the Jefferson County situation, Tom. Did she tell you about that? My father would nod with the careful attention of a man encountering information he wasn't sure what to do with. I watched him process it in real time. The small recalibrations, the way he looked at me between the director's sentences, as if trying to map the person he'd always categorized onto the person being described. I had spent years hoping for that look. I had stopped hoping for it somewhere around 27. Getting it now, at 31, from a corner of my parents' anniversary party, felt complicated in a way I didn't have words for yet. The toasts began after the main course. Kyle's wife had organized them, of course, because Kyle's wife organized everything with the same cheerful, capable efficiency she brought to the minivan in the school calendar. A college friend of my father's. A neighbor couple. Then Kyle, who stood and spoke about legacy and loyalty and what it meant to grow up watching his father build something worth inheriting. He said all the right things. He said them well. The room applauded warmly. My name was not mentioned, not once, not in passing, not as an afterthought. I was at the table now, visible, impossible to miss, and my brother's toast moved from his own childhood memories directly to his children and my parents' shared future without ever landing on me. I sat with my hands in my lap and kept my face neutral, which I was good at. You get good at it when you spent years learning that your reaction is the only thing you can control. Director Cole noticed. I felt him notice. The way you feel someone shift their weight beside you in a dark building. He waited until the last official toast had been delivered and the room had relaxed into applause and the band was beginning a quiet intro. Then he picked up his fork and tapped it gently against his glass. Just once, that was all it took. The room quieted with the reflexive attention that significant people command without trying. He stood. I apologize for speaking out of turn, he said, and his voice carried the effortless projection of someone who had delivered instructions over wind and radio static and crowd noise. At 40 years, a marriage deserves every word it gets, and I'll add mine briefly. He smiled at my parents, genuinely, and there was warmth in it, the warmth of someone who meant every word. Tom, Patricia, 40 years is a testament to your patience with each other, your investment in this family, your willingness to show up. I raise my glass to both of you. People raised their glasses. My mother pressed a hand to her heart. But, he said, and the single word landed with a quiet shift of weight, I'd be remiss tonight if I didn't say something else. He paused. The band had gone fully quiet. The room held. I've spent 30 years in emergency management, he said. I have worked alongside hundreds of first responders, incident commanders, and crisis leaders. I can tell you with certainty, the way I can tell you that water flows downhill and fire needs oxygen, that the quality of those people is not evenly distributed. Most are good. A smaller number are excellent. And every now and then, rarely, you encounter someone who changes the situation just by being in it. My heartbeat had become audible to me. I want to introduce you to one of those people, he said, and looked directly at me, Battalion Chief Megan Carter, who has led her crew through situations that most people in this room cannot imagine, and who did so, every time, with the kind of decision-making that saves lives and the kind of humility that never asked for anything in return. Several heads swiveled. My father was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something unmoored, searching, like a man who has just been handed a map of a place he thought he already knew. 14 months ago, the director continued, I stood at the perimeter of the Ridgeline fire in Athens County and watched this woman lead her crew into a structure that the local incident commander had already pulled people out of, because she had assessed the building, run the math in her head, and determined that there were still people inside with a viable extraction window. She was right. 4 survivors. He paused. The building came down 11 minutes after her crew came out. The room had the particular quality of silence that follows information landing. Chief Carter was not celebrated in any newspaper for that decision, he said quietly. She wrote her incident report, debriefed her crew, and drove back to Pittsburgh. He let that sit. I have been trying to understand, he said, his tone shifting to something conversational, almost gentle, why someone with that kind of record, at her own parents' 40th anniversary, was seated by the catering door next to a ficus. A collective inhale moved through the closest tables. My mother's hand was back at her throat. Kyle was very still. My father had stopped looking at me and was now looking at the tablecloth, and his jaw was working in the way it did when he was holding something in. I'm not interested in embarrassing anyone, the director said. And he meant it. There was no performance in his voice. I am simply a man who has watched too many good people accept less than they deserve because the people who love them never looked up long enough to see them clearly. He turned back to my parents, and his tone softened fully. Tom, Patricia, you raised a woman of extraordinary character. I wanted you to know that. I wanted this room to know it. He raised his glass to Megan. The response was not polite applause. It was the real kind. The kind that builds from a few people and pulls in the rest until it fills the room from the floor up. Someone near the front stood, and then a few others, and then more. I was looking at the center of the table. I could not look up yet. My eyes were burning in a way that had nothing to do with smoke. The director sat down beside me and said nothing. He didn't need to. It took a while for the evening to find its footing again after that. The band resumed. Dessert arrived. The noise level climbed back toward what it had been, but the quality of the room had changed the way rooms change after lightning. Everything the same, but different. People I didn't know came to our table. A woman who worked with the county emergency services introduced herself and shook my hand with both of hers. An older man who had served as a volunteer firefighter for 20 years found me between courses and told me that what the director had said meant something to him. Each time, I thanked them and tried to mean it, which wasn't hard because I did. What was hard was my father. I felt him before I saw him coming, the way I had always felt him coming since childhood. That particular shift in the air when Thomas Carter decided to move towards something he had been avoiding. He appeared at my left shoulder at the end of dessert, when the director had stepped away to speak with someone on the other side of the room. He sat down in the chair the director had vacated. For a moment, he simply looked at the table. My father was not a man who searched for words. He was precise, economical, deliberate. Watching him search now was unfamiliar enough to make my throat tighten. I didn't know, he said finally. About the fire. The building. I know you didn't, I said. I didn't tell you. Why not? I considered the answer carefully, because by the time I would have told you, we would have been talking about Kyle's new contract. He absorbed that. His jaw did the thing again. That's fair, he said quietly. I hadn't expected that. I had expected deflection, or reframing, or the gentle implication that I was being sensitive. Not that's fair. I don't know how to follow what you do, he said. I've never known how to follow it. It frightened me when you were young, the things you wanted. The running toward danger instead of away from it. He exhaled through his nose. And I think I convinced myself that if I didn't follow it too closely, I didn't have to be frightened. Dad, I know, he said. That was selfish. The word landed between us. You were in a burning building, he said. 11 minutes before it came down. His voice was very controlled, which meant he was working hard. And I didn't know. And that man, he nodded toward where Director Cole stood across the room. He had to stand up at my own anniversary party to tell me who my daughter is. I looked at the tablecloth. I stopped telling you things when it felt like you weren't interested in hearing them. I know. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I know, he said again, and his voice cracked, just barely, at the end of the word. We sat in silence for a moment. The band was playing something slow and old, and a few couples had moved on to the dance floor. My mother was among them, dancing with Kyle's oldest child who barely reached her hip. My father reached across and put his hand on mine. He was not a man who did that. I could count on one hand the number of times. I've been sitting over there all evening, he said, gesturing toward the head table, watching that man introduce you to half this room, and thinking about all the times someone must have introduced you to a room, and I wasn't there to see it. He paused. And I'm sorry for that. I am sorry for a lot of things I've been comfortable not saying. My eyes were doing the burning thing again. There's a lot of ground to make up, I said. I know. He squeezed my hand once. But I'd like to start. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice enough for more than that. He stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "Come find me before you leave tonight. I want to hear about Pittsburgh, about your work, all of it." He hesitated. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," I said. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant something. Then he walked back toward the head table, but he paused halfway and turned back, and in the warm, unsteady light of the string overhead, he looked at me with something he hadn't been able to show me in 31 years, something simple and long overdue. Pride. I exhaled slowly. The rest of the evening moved the way the end of a long shift moves, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular quality of time that has found its level. The band played. People danced. The cake was cut to great ceremony. Kyle gave me an awkward side hug near the dessert table and said, "I didn't know about the fire thing either," and I said, "I know," and we stood there for a moment with all the unsaid years between us, which was honest at least, more honest than pretending. Director Cole found me near the exit at the end of the night, when guests were gathering coats and trading final embraces. "You okay?" he asked. "Getting there," I said. He nodded like that was the right answer. "Your father talked to you." "He did." "Good." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the thinning crowd. "For what it's worth, I meant every word tonight. You have done the kind of work that most people never see, and you have done it without asking anyone to look." "I wasn't sure you should have said it," I admitted. In the moment, I wanted to disappear. "I know." He smiled. That's how I knew it needed saying. I looked at the remaining guests, at my mother hugging a college friend near the door, at my father standing with Kyle, at the empty dance floor where the band was packing up. "I spent a lot of years sitting at the back of rooms in this family," I said. "I got pretty comfortable there." "That's the problem with getting comfortable somewhere you don't belong," he said. "You start to believe it's where you should be." I thought about that on the drive back to the hotel. I thought about it lying in the dark afterward, staring at a ceiling fan I couldn't see, listening to the highway 3 blocks away. In the months that followed, things changed in the careful, imperfect way. Things actually change when people are trying. My father and I talked on the phone on Sunday evenings, which had never happened before. He asked specific questions about my work. Not general ones, the kind that close a subject, but specific ones, the kind that open it. He started following the department's public communications. He texted me once after a warehouse fire made the local news, just 3 words. "Was that you?" And I said yes, and he said, "Be careful." And that was more than I had heard from him in a year. My mother was slower to change, and I made my peace with that. She started introducing me correctly at church, which sounds small and isn't. She stopped redirecting conversations away from my career with that particular polite pivot she had perfected. Sometimes she looked at me with something that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite pride, but was movement in that direction. That was enough. Kyle and I found our way to an honesty we had never had, the kind that requires admitting you let things go unsaid for too long. He told me he'd always thought I didn't care what the family thought, that my confidence read as indifference. I told him that confidence and indifference are not the same thing, and that I had spent years caring very much and simply learning to carry it alone. He listened. We are not best friends. We are learning to be something better than strangers. Director Cole became a constant in my life in a way neither of us planned. We grabbed coffee twice a year, talked through policy, swapped incident reports, argued occasionally about resource allocation. He never acted like he had done me a favor. He acted like he had simply corrected a miscalculation. Once, over bad coffee at a conference in Cleveland, I thanked him again for the speech. He waved it off the way he always did. "You did the work," he said. "Someone just needed to read it out loud." I've thought about that many times since. The way worth doesn't disappear when it goes unacknowledged. The way it accumulates quietly in incident reports and extracted survivors and decisions made in smoke, whether or not anyone at your parents' anniversary dinner knows about it. If you've ever sat at the table nearest the exit, if you've ever watched someone describe you in the space of a sentence and move on, if you've ever carried competence like a secret, hoping someday someone would ask about it, I want to tell you what I learned at the Whitmore estate on a warm evening in June. You don't need permission to be in the room. You just need one person who reads the room clearly enough to tell the truth about what they see. Sometimes that person is a director of emergency management with a glass of wine and nothing left to prove. Sometimes, eventually, it's your father. And sometimes, if you've spent enough years doing the work without asking anyone to watch, it's you. Standing somewhere in the middle of a room that used to feel like the back, realizing you were never as far from the center as they made you believe.